Welcome to the Real News Network. This is Reality Asserts Itself, and I'm Paul J. Now joining us on Reality Asserts Itself is a man who's very well known for his writings and research and his scholarship on Israel and Palestine and the conflict there, Norman Finkelstein. Thanks for joining us, Norman.
Thank you for having me.
So Norman's one of the foremost scholars of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's written about a dozen books on many topics, including U.S. foreign policy towards Israel, the use and abuse of the history of the Holocaust, and Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. His controversial legacy as an academic was made into an award-winning documentary, American Radical, The Trials of Norman Finkelstein, and I just found out that Norman's actually never watched the film, and further into this interview, I'll ask him why. He's also controversial among many activists for his unsparing criticism of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. His latest book is Method and Madness, The Hidden History of Israel's Assault on Gaza. So, thanks for joining us. So we started kind of getting into a bit of your biographical story, but let's go back sort of to the beginning. Your mother was a Holocaust survivor, and your family came from Poland. Where's the family originally?
Both of my parents were from Warsaw, and both of them were in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Germans invaded Poland in September 1939. I think the ghetto was built about a year and a half after, if I'm not mistaken. They were both in the ghetto until April 1943, when there was the uprising and then the Nazi suppression of the uprising. The survivors of the uprising, the numbers are something like around 30,000. They were all deported to Majdanek concentration camp. So both of my parents were deported to Majdanek. And then eventually my mother ended up in 2 slave labor camps, and my father ended up in Auschwitz, though as I understand it, he was in something like 7 or 8 concentration camps. He ended up in Auschwitz. He was in the Auschwitz Death March. He was liberated by the Americans. My late mother was liberated by the Russians. And then they ended up in the DP, the displaced people camps, in Austria, Linz, Austria, where my eldest brother, Henry, was born. And then they ended up in the United States. My father was active in the left wing of the Zionist movement, Hashomer Hatzair. My mother, as I gather, she was, both my parents were extremely sympathetic to the Soviet Union. To the last day of their lives, they died 20 years ago now, in 1995. To the last day of their lives, you could not criticize Stalin. Could not say one single word against him.
What did they make of the critiques or the revelations?
They didn't care. As far as they were concerned, and it's factually correct, it was the Soviet Union that defeated the Nazis. The whole war was fought in the Eastern Front. About 200,000 Americans were killed, about 400,000 British were killed, about 30 million Russians were killed. That sort of tells you the story. On the Eastern Front, it was a war of annihilation, and 95% of the troops, the Nazi troops, were on the Eastern Front throughout the war. So as far as they were concerned, the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis, and that's all they cared about. I wouldn't say they were narrow-minded. They were very anti-war, and they felt that the Soviet people understood war, understood what it means to pass through a war. And so there was a certain sense of affinity to the Soviet people and to the Soviet Union. And they didn't care about, they didn't believe the critiques. They would say it's all CIA. Even though my mother was extremely intelligent. She was classically educated, knew many languages, displayed her knowledge of Latin and many other languages. And also English. Her English was quite extraordinary. But as I said, the human capacity for self-deception is bottomless. And you could not get my parents to budge on the question of Stalin.
What was their attitude towards American politics?
I would say, I don't want to use such a forceful word as hated, but they saw the world through the prism of the Nazi Holocaust. They were eternally in debt to the Soviet Union, and so anyone who was anti-Soviet, they were very harsh on. And you know, my parents were real survivors. There are a lot of people who claim they were survivors of Nazi Holocaust. It's complete nonsense. The Nazi Holocaust was an extremely efficient, as the late Raoul Hilberg, the chief historian in the Nazi Holocaust, the most knowledgeable, as he described it, was an assembly line, factory-like extermination of the Jews, which meant very few people survived. The figures Hilberg gives and others who are knowledgeable, like Henry Friedlander, who I guess has already passed from the scene also, under 100,000 Jews survived.
What was their attitude to the creation of the State of Israel?
No, I wouldn't. I think they did accept that idea. There's a difference between the idea of a state where Jews can go and the state of Israel, the specific state of Israel and how it carried on in world affairs. They accepted the first part, that after the feeling of my parents was the whole world abandoned the Jews during World War II. I don't fully agree with that. I'm just giving you their point of view. The whole world abandoned them, and therefore Jews needed a refuge. They needed a place to go when the moment of truth, if and when it came. So they accepted that idea. If you asked, as I did, if you asked, then do you accept that this state has the right to discriminate against non-Jews? Well, no. You couldn't even argue with them about it. There was no point in arguing. Of course, they rejected that idea. So if you ask, how can you support a Jewish state if by Jewish state it means that non-Jews are discriminated against? Well, the way my late mother dealt with contradictions was to say, quote, "Get away from me." She didn't want to argue, you know. It's one of those contradictions that you can't resolve in your mind. It's not easy to resolve on paper either, even if you've thought about it for a long time. So they accepted that idea. What they rejected was its practical manifestation, namely the actual state of Israel, because it aligned itself with the West. But they would never, in public, say anything against the Soviet Union. And that was a requirement at the time, because we're talking about the 1970s and 80s with the whole Free Soviet Jewry movement, and you were supposed to denounce the Soviet Union as being anti-Semitic, and so on and so forth. So in order to hawk your Holocaust credentials, you had to, at that time, denounce the Soviet Union. Impossible. They would never. They had that level of faithfulness and gratitude. I mean, it's a strange thing to have to say, but they had a sense of gratitude to Stalin and faithfulness.
And how early in the development of the State of Israel do they become mostly critics of Israel?
No, very early, because Israel officially aligned itself with the U.S. at the time of the Korean War.
And it was the issue of the expulsion of Palestinians an issue, or
it didn't exist? Nobody knew. Nobody knew in the West that Palestinians even existed. My parents didn't know. Most people who were, in Europe and coming over, they didn't know anything about Palestinians.
So do you, as you become more politically conscious, I don't know, as you hit 10, 11, 12, 13 years old?
They were very anti the Vietnam War. And of course, I used to just repeat what they said in class. I didn't know. And I remember once there was supposed to be a debate, and I had myself all primed with statements from my parents about the Vietnam War. And I remember my parents got nervous because they weren't paranoid, but they were scared. They wouldn't sign. They were scared of secret police and CIA and FBI. Of course, they lived through the Rosenbergs, and I remember my father once...
Quickly, for younger people that don't know, like 3 sentences on who the Rosenbergs were.
Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were Jews from the Lower East Side accused of being spies for the Soviet Union. became an international cause célèbre, and they were eventually executed by under Eisenhower. Incidentally, it was all Jews who sort of involved themselves in the process. They wouldn't sign a petition, you know, because they were afraid, even though, of course, they felt deeply for the Rosenbergs. When my father came over, one of the conditions for coming into the U.S. is you had to sign a statement saying you would fight for the U.S. in the event of a war with Russia. He signed it, but he was very pained by having to do that. And so they got very nervous, and I remember we were standing in the kitchen, and I was reciting my arguments, and all of a sudden, my mother and father started to say, "But you better say some arguments in favor of the war." Where did that come from? And the art of the debating team was they would give you what was called a resolution or a proposition, and you had to be equally adept at arguing both sides. You would come in and they would tell you, you're going to argue the affirmative or you're going to argue the negative. And my mother, she was really, she was against it. She said, that just teaches you to be two-faced. I don't really agree with her now. There is a value to the devil's advocate and learning, understanding every aspect of your argument before you take a side. So hearing out the devil's advocate. But it was also true. It did teach you to be two-faced. Both of those facts are true. And there was, as I said, there was this deep
What was their attitude to the creation of the state
you
of
had to
Israel?
be faithful to a cause, truthful to a cause. A cause is not something intellectual, it's something about death and destruction. You know, sometimes if I would talk in my family about war, my mother would go, "What do you know about war?" Which was true. Really, what did I know about war? So these were not intellectual matters. As I said, my late mother was extremely intelligent,
Now,
but she didn't teach me how to think through how you make
Well,
these
here's I
arguments.
was about to ask you, do you then internalize this loyalty to the Soviet Union, their attitude towards Stalin and so on, as you become a teenager? Is this part of your identity?
Oh, sure, it was. The stories now are funny. I remember in like 7th grade in my social studies class, we're doing World War II. And of course, I'm defending Stalin, which is like, where does this guy come from? My social studies teacher was named Josh Abramson, I still remember. He was an Orthodox Jew. And so he'd say, I would say that Stalin transformed Soviet Union from a backward agricultural country into an industrial country. And there's education, which was true, and there was education and health. And then he would say, what about all the death? And I would go home, I'd say to my mother, what about all the death? And she says, well, that's the price that you have to pay to achieve these things. I would come back, say, that's the price you have to pay. He would say, oh, in other words, you're saying the ends justify the means. I didn't know what the hell that means, ends, means, what the hell he's talking about. I'd go home and say, Ma, are you saying the ends justify? Yes, in this case, the ends, I'd go right back. Just repeating, you know, what I hear at home. It took me a long time to develop my own intellectual identity.
Your parents had great loyalty, fidelity to the Soviet Union. You had kind of internalized the same thing, and are arguing at school in defense of Stalin and so on. Well, it ain't that much longer, I'm guessing. Well, you're a Maoist, and part of being a Maoist may be defense of Stalin, but it sure is critique of the Soviet Union, which your parents never accepted. So how did you get there, and what did that mean in terms of your relationship with your parents?
I'm not really sure how I got there. I'd have to search my memory how I ended up a Maoist, but I can say as a general proposition, even though I attach a lot of value to ideas and the intellectual department of the human personality, I want to see practical change. I want to see real lives improve. That was something I got from my parents. And so in China, it seemed to be happening. there seemed to be real, genuine improvement in the lives of ordinary people. And
I think most of the evidence says in those early years there was.
yes, there was, but there also a lot of illusion. There was, but there was also a lot of illusion. And so for me, it was the proof of the pudding. The eating is the test of the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Yes. And there it was not a theory. It was a reality. We believed back then, or many of us, some of us, who called ourselves Maoists, that human beings were genuinely being transformed, the new socialist man, putting society ahead of the individual, as Mao Zedong, the slogan was to fight self. And I believed all of that. I believed it with the wholeness of my being. I believed it. So for me, it was the practical fact that the lives of human beings were being improved and that a better world was not just in theory, but in practice possible. It was real. I mean, I was to the point, I remember when I was in college, I had a pair of work shoes like one of your camera persons is wearing now. And I was napping in the study lounge. I was a very hard worker, always reading, always studying. I took off my shoes, I went to sleep, and when I woke up, the shoes were gone. And it was winter, and I had to walk home barefoot. And I come to my class on China the next day, angry at the fact that my shoes were stolen. But what do I say? I said, this would never happen in China. I mean, that's how I saw China. It was, you know, God is great, God is good, let's thank him for our food. This was China. China is great, or Mao is great, Mao is good, let us thank him for.
And for people that don't know the period, this was not so unique. There were Maoists all over the world.
No, it wasn't so unique. Now it's an era that's completely vanished. But back then it was not so uncommon. Even people like Shirley MacLaine were flaming Maoists back then. People will have forgotten. Actually, your listeners won't even know who Shirley MacLaine is.
The Black Panthers were holding up the Red Book.
Yeah, we're marketing the Red Book. But
let me go back. Go back to your parents, though, because to be a Maoist, you have to disengage from the Soviet Union.
No, you don't really appreciate the capacity for self-deception. My parents were absolutely convinced that there was no split between the Soviet Union and China. Yes. They thought it was all made up by the CIA and the usual thing, you know, everything is the CIA, everything is a conspiracy. So,
they didn't believe that Mao Zedong had denounced the Soviet Union after Stalin.
No, absolutely not. They didn't even believe that Stalin killed Trotsky. No. That's, listen, you'd be surprised how much.
Okay, but what about you and your beliefs? Because you'd grown up internalizing this Soviet argument. You knew the Chinese were attacking the Soviet Union.
Look, I was a contradictory figure because I believed in the ideology, but I attached too much value to intellectual life to believe it blindly. And so I always embraced the intellectuals who were Maoists. So I was close to Paul Sweezy at the time. The leading intellectual Maoist in the world was, nobody will remember his name now, but he was quite prominent back then, was Charles Bettelheim in Paris. I went to study with him. I read everything. I didn't read to learn. I have to be honest about that. I read so I can answer any argument. I was looking for information, data, which would enable me to defend the cause. But I didn't really try, I didn't want to see if the cause may be flawed. I didn't read with that in mind.
There was no skepticism.
No, it was, we're arming for war, intellectual war, and I needed to, the books were the ammunition. I knew so much about it. I'm not boasting, it's an element of fanaticism. I knew so much about it that in my undergraduate institution, I was the first undergraduate to precept a course on China, because I knew more than any professor. I was a fanatic.
What breaks it for you?
Oh, it's very simple what breaks it for me. It was the overthrow of the Gang of, what was called back then, the Gang of Four.
Which is Mao's wife and...
Oh, believe it or not, I know it's odd, I could tell you all their names. It was Zhang Zhengzhao, Wang Hongwen, Zhang Jing, and the other guy's name.
Okay.
Yeah. I was devastated.
Well,
I wasn't devastated so much because I was wrong.
How did that prove you were wrong?
Oh, because everything was overthrown overnight. The whole Maoist system, which we thought new socialist man, they all believe in putting self second, fighting self, and then overnight the whole thing was reversed.
But there were other people
which meant,
kind of in your shoes.
Which meant the people weren't really that committed to it. And it came out, there was just an awful lot of corruption. The people who we thought were absolutely selfless were very self-absorbed. And it was clear, the overthrow of the Gang of Four had huge popular support. It's not like it was some midnight military coup. Everybody was thrilled at the prospect of ridding themselves of these ideologues as if they had now been freed from shackles. So, as I said, it wasn't so much that I was wrong. It was I had made a fool of myself because I would denounce everyone who disagreed with me as being a bourgeois and a petty bourgeois. I remember I had a friend, his name was Roy Friedman, and his father said to me once, "Norman, before you get to China, there's going to be a McDonald's at the Great Wall." And I just laughed at him. In fact, he's right. He was right. But he said, "Oh, you're such a petty bourgeois." He said to me, "You know, Norman, why do you always call me a petty bourgeois? Why can't I be a bourgeois?
Make more money.
Why do I have to be a petty bourgeois?" But I was absolutely insufferable. I know it was, because I have a friend, her name is Zena Rutkin, and she saved some of my postcards and letters. And she sent them to me a few years ago. I mean, I cringed when I read them. Everything I dismissed with this all-knowing knowledge, Marxism, Leninism was the science. As if I even got past chemistry in high school, but the science. And we knew everything. We knew where history was going. We knew everything. We knew nothing. Very foolish.
You write that you had to go to bed after you heard the news of the
overthrow. Yeah, I
of
was
the
in
Gang
bed for
of Four.
3 weeks. I was totally devastated. Professor Bettelheim, who was the world's most distinguished Maoist intellectual, he was hospitalized. Yeah, you don't know. But it shouldn't altogether surprise you. Many people think it was the McCarthy that destroyed the Communist Party. That's absolutely not true. When you're a communist back then, you had the inner strength to withstand McCarthyism because it was the cause. What destroyed the Communist Party was Khrushchev's speech.
On Stalin.
When people suddenly discovered they had been duped, they were fools. There were not an insignificant number of people who committed suicide. They gave their whole lives to a lie. It's even
Just
true.
for people who don't know, this is Khrushchev makes a speech in 1956, which are about the crimes of Stalin, and this is
as it happened,
many people quit communist parties.
To make it topical, it was an Israeli who got hold of the speech, because it was an Israeli member of the Communist Party of Israel who got hold of the speech and then distributed it. And Communist Party people were absolutely devastated. That's when they left the party in droves.
It's not just Mao. I mean, does not come kind of crashing an important piece of your whole identity, which was faith in the Soviet Union, Stalin, now Mao. There's a big piece of who you were.
Yeah, it was not a big piece. It was the whole of who I was. I was, I say not happily, but I remember a friend of mine, a childhood friend, he's now the chair of the history department at Cornell University. He's a real right-winger now. But he once said to me, you know, Norman, you become a bore. If you went into my room, I had pictures of Lin Biao and Mao Zedong, the posters. Socialism is advancing from victory to victory. Another poster, long live the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was so funny that once, it was New Year's Eve, and some nut just randomly shot a bullet into our home. Had no political resonance. My mother calls the police. So police come, so what do the police do? They want to look into every room. So of course, they have to come to my room. They open the door. Long live the dictatorship of the proletariat. Socialism is advancing from victory to victory. My mother looks at the police officer. Police officer looks at my mother, and she says, my son likes Chinese people. That's how she extricated herself. But I was a complete bore. I was completely monolithic.
Okay, so
some people still think I'm a complete bore. So.
You're saying it was this identity is not a part of you, it was the whole of you.
Yeah.
So what's left after this 3 weeks? Who is Norman at the end of this 3 weeks? What happens?
I got involved in other causes. I was involved with Central America, but nothing that totally consumed me anymore. I guess I was tired of ideologies. I was tired of theories. I was not a big fan of the Sandinistas. I went to Nicaragua at the time. I happened to have the misfortune of having gone there on the centenary of Marx's death, I think that week or something. I arrived the same day as the Pope. I remember that. But when the day the Pope arrived in Nicaragua, it was 82, I guess, or 84, maybe 84. And all I heard was science of Marxism, Leninism, the science of Marxism, Leninism. It rubbed me all the wrong way. I remember I was in one factory. I was working in a textile factory just to get experience at the ground level. And one of the militantes, as they were called back then, she calls over a worker and she says, "This is our best worker. He's our best worker." I said, "Oh, really? What makes him our best worker?" She says, "Oh, he does everything we tell him." I said, so I ain't going back there. I mean, when I say I ain't going back there, I say I'm not going back to my Marxist-Leninist phase. I was a nut. I went to Paris to study. You know what I did? I mean, it's just an embarrassment even to say it now. I spent the whole time in Paris. I read 25 volumes of Lenin. That's what I did. I brought over the collected works, which weren't not so expensive back then, because
they're heavy.
I had a roller. It was 55 volumes. I brought over all 55 volumes. Yes, because for me, it was not just it was an eccentric form of fanaticism. I had to grasp it intellectually, or I thought I was grasping it intellectually because I was reading. In fact, I wasn't grasping it intellectually.
So as you start to put together what amounts to a new identity, which I guess has a big piece of it, not wanting to accept stuff blindly, when does Israel-Palestine become your focus?
I would say the big influence at that time was Professor Chomsky, because he had the same, quote-unquote, radical view of the world, but he prided himself in his works on being ideologically free. He said, just a little common sense, what he calls Cartesian logic. Look for the facts, and that's all you need. You don't need big theories. And as I said, I was theoried out.
Okay.
That's not on my radar at all. You know, people say, nowadays people say that I'm obsessed with Israel-Palestine. Actually, I had no interest in it at all. I was involved in the anti-war movement, struggles in Central America, civil rights, things like that. Israel-Palestine doesn't come on my radar until the day Israel invades Lebanon in June 1982. I was involved with a small group of Meshuggah Jews called JMO, Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon. At that point, you have to remember, this is 1982, no normal person was criticizing Israel. It's true, you had to be a little bit crazy. The only one who had sort of like intellectual distinction, the two people who had intellectual distinction and were identified with criticism of Israel, the two people were Professor Chomsky and Edward Said. But the rank and file were slightly off. I mean, a lot of loose screws upstairs in our little group. Now, of course, they would say, including yourself, maybe. That's for others to judge. But one of the issues that came up was, are you a Zionist or not? And everybody's anti-Zionist, and I was not going there because I had my share of with ideologies. I wasn't going to go along with it until I knew what I was talking about.
And the point here is, do you accept there should be a state of Israel or not?
Well, at that time, to be an anti-Zionist meant that you don't support the state of Israel. That's correct. And we had to achieve principles of unity for our group, and it was perfectly obvious that if you deny Israel's existence, you are confined to a sect or a cult.
Well, you
no
deliberately
way.
missed a word here, right to exist. A lot of people, I mean, Hamas doesn't deny Israel exists, but some people in Hamas deny its right to exist.
We can get to that later. At the time, their question was, are you going to recognize Israel?
Okay.
Because if you don't recognize Israel, then you've lost 99.9% of the Jewish community. Then what's the whole point of forming Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon? We come to 10 Jews. And as you correctly stated, that was interrelated with where you stood on Zionism, or that's how it was understood. And I wasn't going to go along until I did significant research. I wanted to understand. Now it was no longer just looking for arguments to support my cause. I wanted to be careful what I'm wedding myself to before I did it. And I sat down and I started to read on Zionism, and after about a couple of years, I decided, well, what the heck, maybe I'll turn it into my doctoral dissertation, because I was one of those ABDs.
How old are you at this time?
Okay, 1982, so I'm 29. I was one of those ABDs, all but dissertation, because I was going to write my dissertation on the transition to socialism, and then the whole thing collapses. I'm finished with transitions, I'm finished with academia. I worked in the after-school program with kids. But then I figured, all right, let's turn this into my doctoral dissertation. And that's when I got very much involved and in it as an intellectual object. And so now I was politically involved after the June '82 war. With my dissertation, I was intellectually involved. And the fact that I was Jewish, of course, meant there was now a personal element also to it, obviously being Jewish and where you stand on Israel. So everything sort of now came together, my political interest, my intellectual interest, and my family interest, because the Holocaust obviously back then was being used, even more so than today, as a weapon to justify Israel's denial of Palestinian rights and its criminal policies. So everything now came together, but still the fact of the matter was, if you ask why I'm still at it today, 32 years later, the answer is not because I'm obsessed. The answer is because it's not been resolved. Had it been resolved, I would have moved on. But I could never in my own mind or heart, I could never justify moving on because I'm bored.
But you know,
my closest friend in the occupied territories, Musa Abu Heshhesh, he's the field representative in the Hebron district for B'Tselem. If I ever told him, I'm bored already with Palestine, I'm moving on, You know, I could never look at him again. What do you mean you're moving on? I can't move on, meaning him. So what do you mean you're moving on? And it was also, you know, what I got from my parents, that faithfulness. You don't abandon a cause because you're bored. That's not a justification. So I stuck to it. Faithfulness.
But you didn't just stick to it, you stuck your neck out. You lost positions in universities. You got, I mean, when you came in here, one of our colleagues here said, you know, you're one of the most hated people. Do you have a bodyguard? I mean, you suffered a lot of slings and arrows.
I would say I endured slings and arrows. I would never use the word suffering. I know suffering. The other day I was in Geneva and I was asked to give a little speech on behalf of a family, 4 of whom their children are in jail, the Isawi family. The mother, who, as I said, puts on a very strong face, she just broke into tears. That's suffering. Oh, I didn't mention, one of the sons was killed. So one son was killed. Currently, 4 children are in jail. That's suffering. You know, I'm past 60. I'm in good health. I have a roof over my head. I have food on my table. But you can't call that suffering.
Were there not moments where you wondered, why do I keep doing this? Yeah, I'm not sure if everyone knows your story. And I mean, it's pretty easy to go to Wikipedia and get all the detail. But you were ostracized, not just by the Jewish community, by academia, I mean, you were not out there on your own, but you were to a large extent out there on your own. And you didn't flinch.
No, there was never any moment where I had any thought of flinching. I have my flaws. In fact, I have significant flaws in my character, of which I'm perfectly aware. But one thing I could say, and I don't think anybody will dispute, I'm not for sale. You know, even in what I write, if somebody were to come along like Sheldon Adelson and say, I'll give you $1 million if you change one word in the Holocaust industry, I could say with absolute certainty I wouldn't do it. I mean, maybe people don't believe me, and you can test me, anyone who's listening. Offer me $1 million to change one word. There's no way I would do it. Well, now, when my editor tells me to change a word because I have poor usage, of course I'll change it. But I'm not for sale. So there was never any, you know, there are feelings you have. I remember when I came back after I was denied tenure, I called up.
Was this after the Holocaust industry?
No, this was after I was denied tenure at the pool. And I came home. I remember I lied down on the bed, and I was at the time quite close to Professor Chomsky and his wife Carol, and his late wife. And I called up Chomsky and I said, "Do you think I did anything wrong?" Which is different than, do I regret what I did? It's a question of, did I make mistakes for which I should be held accountable? And I remember his answer was, look, Norman, everybody does things wrong. Everyone makes mistakes. That would bother me. Self-inflicted wounds, which compromise my honor, compromise my dignity. Yes, that would bother me. But the loss of teaching, I don't think the price was particularly high.
Why did you write the Holocaust industry?
Oh, the Holocaust industry, actually, I have no recollection ever of having written a book. I don't know why. My mind, I don't remember the process. But I know I wrote it very quickly because I knew a lot of what was being said was not true. I grew up in my home. My mother used to say, because she liked to quote with purposeful irony, Henry Ford, history is bunk. And, you know, Ford was an anti-Semite, and she was aware of it, but she liked to quote, there was an irony there. Because everything, not everything, but so much of what was being said was just complete nonsense.
Just quickly for people who don't know, the basic thesis of the book.
Basically, the thesis of the book is very simple, that I don't really talk about the Nazi Holocaust itself. There I rely on the best historians and what they've had to say on the subject. I talk about its exploitation by mostly American Jews for political and also at that time financial gain. There was this whole shakedown racket of Europe called Holocaust compensation, which was completely fraudulent, as I think I convincingly demonstrate in the book. And so it's about the exploitation. And it wasn't intended to be a grand, systematic, methodical analysis. The subtitle is Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. Just some of my reflections.
This had a lot to do with Israel using the Holocaust narrative to justify its...
Yeah, Israel exploiting the Nazi Holocaust, but also American Jews exploiting the Nazi Holocaust.
Now, go back to that group you were in at the Lebanese War, and not wanting to get into the debate about should Israel exist for alienating...
I wanted to get into debate, but I wanted to get into debate with knowledge. I'm not going to do it because it's an ideological fad. I sat down and I started to read on the subject.
Okay, but my point is that that book, a lot of people thought, a lot of Jews who didn't agree with you, I mean, a lot of Jews did agree with you and agreed with the book.
Well, not a lot agreed with the book, not that then.
But, well, that's kind of my point, that it was considered inflammatory.
Yeah.
That you didn't have, even though I think even people that agreed with you thought you didn't have to kind of say that the Holocaust was being misused because it was just too sensitive a topic.
Well,
any second thoughts having written it?
No, not at all, because as my publisher said, no, the reason that book, unlike all my other books, that book actually succeeded and reached a wide audience, he said it was just a little bit ahead of the curve. It was already, people were sick and tired of the Nazi Holocaust. You remember the famous line, or infamous line by Jesse Jackson, it was like 1987 or something, he said, we're sick and tired of the Holocaust, and he got really attacked for it. But people were getting, it was obvious that it was being used or put to crass purposes. So I was just a little bit ahead of the curve. Nowadays, the book is not even controversial anymore. So everybody refers to a Holocaust industry. Even Avraham Berg, the former speaker of the Israeli Knesset, he wrote a book on the Holocaust about 4 years ago. And about page 6 or page 8, he refers to, quote, the Shoah industry, Shoah being the Hebrew word for Holocaust. The Shoah industry, it's just a commonplace nowadays. So there's nothing particularly controversial anymore in the book. So I don't have any regrets about it. And it was, for me, it was a sort of, my parents at the end, they didn't care how the Holocaust was being used and exploited. History is bunk, who cares? I cared. It did bother me that my parents' suffering was being used for really nefarious purposes to justify the criminal policies against the Palestinians. That did bother me.
Okay, we're going to move kind of a big jump ahead now because Norman's got a train to catch, and he's going to come back again sometime. We can kind of pick it up. So please join us for the next segment of our series on Reality Asserts Itself with Norman Finkelstein. So in the last segment, we kind of just began telling the story of the writing of the Holocaust industry. And amongst other things, this is a book that I think probably changed the course of your life. You obviously, and you had to know, you were touching one of the most central nerves of the American Jewish population, global Jewish population, if you were. The book, let me paraphrase it very quickly. Essentially that Israel and the founders of the State of Israel and the Israeli government since and others that support it were using the Holocaust to justify an occupation and essentially war crimes. And it's a misuse of the memory of the Holocaust. Is that?
Well, there was a second aspect to it, which actually at the time infuriated people more, which was You might recall in that period there were all these claims about Holocaust compensation, how the Swiss banks had cheated Holocaust survivors, and these were big news stories. And here came these crusading lawyers who were going to get retribution for what were called needy Holocaust victims. And then there were the fat Swiss bankers, the evildoers. And a large part of the book was devoted to showing that it was just a shakedown racket. And all these guys were crooks.
The lawyers.
The lawyers and the whole apparatus, the World Jewish Congress, people like Edgar Bronfman at the time, Rabbi Israel Singer, and then also...
and why were they shakedown artists? Was not this a legitimate claim to get compensation?
It was completely ridiculous to claim.
Why?
It was very simply put by the world's leading authority in the Nazi Holocaust, namely Raoul Hilberg. Incidentally, as I recite the facts, let me just say as a foreground, Raoul Hilberg was a conservative Republican. He swore by the Wall Street Journal. His politics were the exact opposite end of the spectrum from my own. But he was also an extremely scrupulous scholar, and in a class all his own when it came to the question of the Nazi Holocaust. He had literally memorized the entire Nuremberg process, which is several hundred volumes were tucked away in his brain. Yeah, he was an extraordinary figure. And he happened to have, as he put it, he thumbed through the same pages as I did of the congressional record and all the relevant documents. And he said, interestingly enough, he said my conclusions were conservative. They were conservative because I tend to be very cautious because I know one error and I'm going to be hung by it. So I'm very careful in what I claim and make sure there's a voluminous documentation to support it. So here was the basic fact. As Hilberg laid it out, and now I'm quoting him as against myself, there are three basic facts about Jews in this period before World War II and during the Nazi Holocaust. Number one, Jews are overwhelmingly poor. They lived in shtetls in Eastern Europe. They don't have Swiss bank accounts. Number two, if you did happen to have a Swiss bank account, remember, we're in the midst of the worldwide depression. The depression meant if you had money, you lost it. That's why it was a crash. We call it a crash. And number three, if you did have money still, you were one of those rich Jews who managed to survive the depression, you didn't live in a shtetl. If you did have money, you used the money to get out of Nazi-occupied Europe, which means you got out and after the war, you went to the bank and you withdrew your money. So there were no huge sums of money in Swiss banks which were deposited there by Jews and then they were cheated after World War II. Probably the total sum came to about $30 or $40 million, which were in the Swiss banks. And the Swiss bankers themselves, when the whole hysteria began, they were willing to pay the $40 million. But the shakedown artists, people, as I said, like Rabbi Israel Singer, Bert Newborn, the ACLU lawyer, the big liberal, all this gang of crooks, they realized here was a double, sort of like a double opportunity. One, they can come across as vindicating the Nazi Holocaust. And number two, they can make a lot of bucks out of it.
Okay, I got to jump in here for just a second because you're calling people crooks and all this.
Yeah, they were complete thieves.
Okay,
actually, most of them, a large number of them, strangely enough, a large number of them ended up in a lot of trouble with the law.
Well, just let me say one thing, because I don't know enough about this to challenge Norman on this. And he's calling people crooks. So if anybody out there wants to challenge and argue with him that these people aren't crooks, let us know. And are any of these people still alive? Just call crooks?
Well, the funny thing is, one of the leading crook was Rabbi Israel Singer. He used to wear his yarmulke askew. And what happened was he ended up losing his position because he opened up, it's funny, a secret Swiss bank account where he squirreled away money from the World Jewish Congress, he said, for his retirement. And so
he was caught.
He was caught, and Edgar Bronfman, who was the head of the World Jewish Congress, he ended up saying that Singer was a thief, and kicked him out of the World Jewish Congress. Bert Newborn, he went around saying he's doing all of this pro bono. Pro bono. What turned out, I used to call him the pro bono Holocaust huckster. He's at NYU now, and he's a big liberal. They all love Bert Newborn. He got $4 million from the Germans. He sat on the foundation, and he took $4 million from the Holocaust Survivors Foundation. Then...
That's what, because he was their lawyer?
Yeah.
But that's not unusual.
No, but he was going around saying, I'm doing all of this pro bono for needy Holocaust victims. And then he took another 6 or 7 million he asked for from the Swiss case. It was so outrageous that the New York Times ran an editorial personally directing it at Bert Newborn, this crook, and said, what are you asking here? You're billing $750 an hour and you call yourself pro bono? Let me tell you something why it makes me so angry. Because both of my parents were survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. You know what my mother got for being in Majdanek concentration camp and 2 slave labor camps? You know what she got? She got $3,000. That's what she got. And when she was alive, I was the one who shepherded her from lawyer to lawyer, from what was called, there were all of these Jewish organizations, United Restitution Organization. They were supposed to give you money, and they wouldn't give her a cent. And they were raking in all this cash for themselves and claiming to do it for my parents' suffering. It made me sick when I saw what was going on. It was a complete racket, and it was a racket at the expense of the real survivors. Real survivors never got a dime. It's a very interesting story. I go through it, quite in probably painful detail for most people in the expanded edition of the Holocaust Industry. The Holocaust Industry actually started off like 120, 30 pages. By the end, it's now about 350 pages because I added in all the detail about the Swiss banks case and all the other cases. But these people, they were making a fortune over my parents' suffering.
Okay.
My father, incidentally, he did get a reasonable pension, but you want to know why? Because the money was paid out by Germany. And every month, until the last day of his life, every month was a blue envelope. It came from Hanover. I remember because I was also the executor for my father. And the check would come. You had to go to the German consulate to present papers to certify he was still alive. Because, the survivors were dying, which is another aspect of the whole fraud. You ask me, how do I know it's a fraud? There's a very simple reason why. In 1945, the war is over. How many Jews survived the concentration camps, the slave labor camps, and the ghettos? The whole point of the Nazi Holocaust was its efficiency. As Raoul Hilberg said, it was an assembly line, factory-like extermination of the Jews. Very few survived. The figure is probably under 100,000 Jews actually survived the Nazi Holocaust. So we're now in the 1990s. The average survivor was about something around 25 years old. Because if you were older than that, the Nazis exterminated you, and if they were younger than that, the Nazis exterminated you, because they wanted healthy people who can work at the end. So unless you are of a vigorous physical constitution, you were killed. That's the whole point of the Nazi Holocaust. So, both my parents were about 24 in that 25-year-old range. So we're talking about now the late 1990s. Do the math. Who's alive? My parents died 20 years ago, actually this year. My father died this month, January 21st. My mother, October 19th. They were all dead. All of this, they were talking about millions of Holocaust survivors.
To the kind of consequences of you and the choices you made. Mm-hmm. So this book comes out. You're teaching at
Hunter College.
Mm-hmm. And about a year later, you go to DePaul.
Well, I didn't go to DePaul. A year later, I was unceremoniously kicked out of Hunter College. And at that point, I don't want to turn this into a martyrdom, but I had been kicked out of every school in New York, and there was just no place to go anymore. I was pretty desperate.
But when you wrote Holocaust industry, and you take on the primary narrative for the existence of the state of Israel, and you take on a whole question of what you're calling corruption, you got to know there's going to be such consequences.
You see, Paul, you don't know these things in advance. Remember, I'm a nobody. I published with a tiny left-wing press, Verso Books. Nobody reviews books from Verso. And I'm a nobody. You know what my advance, people said, oh, you made so much money off the Holocaust industry. They called me, you're another Holocaust huckster. You know what my advance was for the book? I could tell you, it was $2,000. Nobody thought it was going to be create a huge ruckus. We just figured it would be another left-wing book, read by a very small group of people. So when it comes out... The only thing that is true is the lawyers went crazy over the book. They rolled up, the Verso lawyers, which is a left-wing press, they wrote up 10 pages of stuff they wanted to take out. By the time we finished with the 10 pages, there was no book left. And the head of the Verso Books at the time, who's now my publisher in a new publishing house, Colin Robinson, he was just wonderful. I'm eternally into his debt. He took all the lawyers' criticism, flung it away. I don't care. Let's try it.
Okay. The book comes out, you lose, they fire you at Hunter.
Let
me finish the question. Let me finish the question. So the accusations start to rain down on your head from all the Israeli propaganda machine. Self-hating Jew, Holocaust denier. There is one piece of this, and I wonder, did it concern you? Not all criticism, obviously, of Israel's anti-Semitic, as some of pro-Israeli people would like to suggest, but some is. There really is a virulent anti-Semitic trend in the world. We see it on our videos. Sometimes people ask, how come, on our website, if you write the word Jew in the comments, we have an automatic filter so we can find out if it's pure racism or an actual comment, because there is so much racist stuff that comes. And part of the critique you got from, admittedly, very pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli positions, that somehow you kind of reinforced the Holocaust denial. You were accused of being mixed up with the Holocaust deniers. Now, I'm not suggesting there's any merit to the argument, but how did it affect you emotionally, this tremendous barrage against you?
There are many things to say to that. First of all, I was very close to my parents. Everybody who knows me knows that. I took care of them. They both died from terrible, terrible illnesses. My mother had a cancer which literally, not figuratively, it consumed her whole face. Her whole face turned into blood and boils. It was like out of a science fiction movie. My father had Alzheimer's, and he was a living corpse. And I cared for them. It always happens in families. The burden falls on one of the siblings, and it happened in my case. It was me. So I was very close to them and very close to their suffering. It was horrible what they experienced, and I cared. So there was no way on God's earth that was going to ever diminish their suffering or there was no way I was going to diminish their suffering. And so when I was writing the book, I remember very clearly, it was like my parents were watching over me. Every word I was very careful of. Am I betraying my parents' legacy? Am I betraying what my parents went through? I was very careful about that. There is not one word in that book which my parents would recoil from. They would have had trouble with the book before, where I wrote about Hitler's willing executioners and the claim that all Germans were pathological anti-Semites. And my parents felt that. I didn't agree with them. I never argued with them about it. I felt after what they went through, they're entitled to their opinions, even though I strongly disagreed with them, but not the Holocaust industry. Quite the contrary. For those who actually read the book, take what we just discussed a moment ago. My late mother used to get infuriated when every time you meet anyone in the street, they say, I was a Holocaust survivor. they're appropriating the horror that she went through as their own. And she used to get so exasperated. She would say, if everybody who claims to be a Holocaust survivor actually is one, who did Hitler kill? Who did Hitler kill? Everybody in Mead in New York says I'm a Holocaust survivor. Now it's a second generation Holocaust survivor. I mean, the whole thing is such a joke. If I ever went up to my mother and said I'm a second generation Holocaust survivor, you know, she'd smack me. What do you mean second generation Holocaust survivor? You know what you know what it was? So, no, I was very careful, but it's also true. It's no doubt true, and I try to be objective about these things. I attracted a lot of the wrong people. There's no question about that. There were actually stories which, they were so insane, they were funny. Everybody has his or her ego. I'm not immune to ego. I'm invited to this 2-day conference in Italy, and it's an academic conference devoted to my book. Well, as you can imagine, it was in a place called Teramo in Italy, a beautiful, beautiful, like a ski resort. I'm thrilled. I'm going to have a 2-day conference for my book. I mean, now I'm really made it, you know. So the guy picks me up at the airport. We go for dinner, and he introduces me to his friends, and he introduces me as when I say the guy, the professor who organized the conference, he introduces me as a Holocaust revisionist. What do you mean, Holocaust revisionist? That was the term used back then for Holocaust denier. I said, I'm not a Holocaust revisionist. He says revisionist, revise. We always revising. That's what history is about, revising. So I said, no, we're not revising. I'm not a Holocaust revisionist. Then, after this dinner, I'm beginning to think, Norm, your ego, I think, has gotten you into some trouble here. He tells me in the car, let me show you some of my publications. So I'm a typical academic. He gives me the publications. I immediately flip to the footnotes. Academics don't read text, they just look at footnotes. And I see Lyndon LaRouche all over the footnotes. By the way,
you better quickly tell people who I know he is, but
he was an extreme leftist who turned into an extreme rightist and a complete lunatic in the former incarnation and the later incarnation.
Back to the leftist, back to the rightist, back to the leftist.
So
now they got a thing about the Sauds.
So I see the footnotes are interspersed. LaRouche Chomsky, LaRouche Chomsky, LaRouche Chomsky. I think, uh-oh. Chomsky, fine. LaRouche, big problems. So now I'm beginning to sweat. And I think, I better get myself the hell out of here. What did I get myself into? Then I said, no, remember what John Stuart Mill says, all sides should be heard, and as long as they're letting you speak your mind, you should let others speak their mind. Okay, so now I'm drawing my Millian liberalism. He takes me to the conference. It turns out to be a 2-day conference on Holocaust denial. Oh my Lord, what I got myself into.
Sounds like what they keep organizing in Tehran every so often. Right. You must have been invited to
I'm
those.
Invited, yeah, I'm invited all the time. Yeah. We always argue about that, by the way, me with the Iranians, why I won't show up. So then the guy who introduces me, the one who organized the conference, he starts going through this long introduction. By the end of the introduction, he's proved that it was the Jews who killed John F. Kennedy. So when it came to my turn, I said, let me begin by saying, this guy, he's a nut. He's a complete lunatic. And the funny thing is, at the end of the whole thing, I thought I really insulted him throughout. He came up to me, shook my hand vigorously, he said, good, good. Different points of views, very good.
All right. In the next segment, we're going to talk about some of the consequences of all of this, because you didn't just lose your job at Hunter. You wound up getting isolated over the next few years. You go to DePaul, but then you lose that job and you essentially get isolated by the American and even Western academic community.
Including the leftist.
Okay, we're going to talk about that in the next segment. Please join us for a continuation of our series with Norman Finkelstein on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. you do get a job at DePaul, and as you're at DePaul, the echo or the reverberations or the noise around the Holocaust industry starts to grow, and it becomes really a global phenomenon, which you said earlier you didn't expect. Now you're there from 2001, 2007. You kind of last there for 6 years. What is it like for you there as you're becoming a global star here as a result of how well known the book becomes? When they first hired you, are they just not aware what the Holocaust industry book is?
They didn't really care because I was just hired to replace somebody for a semester. So they just figured, okay, he'll be here for a semester. Who cares really who he is? I was the last minute. It was in the summer. The chair of the department, I remember that a couple of my friends took me to her backyard. They said, you know, that we need somebody for this semester. Can you hire Norm? She didn't really know. She didn't really care. I mean, it's a third-tier school. So she just hired me from a backyard. I remember she was sitting in the backyard on a beach chair. We need somebody. She's the chair. She's in charge of the schedule. They need somebody to fill a spot. They hired me. The problem was how to get rid of me. Once I had my foot in the door and the students liked me, they didn't know how to get rid of me. So just to give you one example, after the first year, the whole hysteria starts up. Finkelstein's teaching at DePaul, got to get rid of Finkelstein. And the students, they didn't want me to go. So they had a sit-in the president's office. The president took me into his office. It was not the current president, it was Father Minogue was his name. The current president never let me into his office. I never met him, I never saw him. I don't even know what he looks like, frankly. But that time it was Father Minogue. He took me into his office and he said to me that, you know, there's a real problem with rehiring you for another year. And I said to him, look, if the issue is that DePaul is going to take a big hit financially because of me, then in my opinion, it's my opinion, you have the right to get rid of me. Because I've always been of the view, nobody should have to bear the burden of my politics. My politics are my problem. And DePaul, as an institution which was servicing working class kids, they should not have to take a financial hit because of me. So if that's the issue, I'm ready to go. I know there's a compensatory issue or countervailing issue of academic freedom, but I'd say between the two, I'm willing to accept DePaul shouldn't have to take the hit, even though it violates some principle of academic freedom. That was my judgment call. I said, but if the issue is my politics, statements that I've made, allegations that have been made about I said this and that, I said, look, I'm willing to go through with you statement by statement, you quote them, and let's go through what was my reasoning. Because I said, you'd be very surprised. People don't understand my personality. They think I'm reckless. Not at all. I think through everything. I am very careful what I say. And I'm not going to say something which in my view cannot be defended on rational grounds. So I said to him, if it's the second, then let's have a discussion. And I remember his words were, he called the chair in and he said, quote, we're going to take a hit. That was his words. We're going to take a hit, but I'm keeping him. However, there are two things to say. We have to try to find the right balance. He was taking, at that point, it was only my first or second year. So there was no danger of me getting tenured. So he figured another year, who knows what's going to happen in a year. He can get hit by a truck, a brick can fall on his head, or maybe he'll get tired, he'll find another job. So it was really just a year. But on the other hand, he took a chance which nobody else was willing to take. And it may sound strange coming from me. I actually respect DePaul for that. Because they kept me for 6 years. in the middle of this hysteria.
This is now 2001, 2007. This is post 9/11, Bush
Yes.
years, and the
Yeah.
whole post 9/11 atmosphere.
There's also another critical factor, which is now forgotten. It was also the second Intifada. And there were it evoked a huge reaction to Israeli repression during those years. And so exactly what you say is true. I was out there. And again, I don't want to sound boastful, but it's a factual matter. I never missed a class. I used to figure my classes to be at 3:15 and around 3:30. I would fly out to a school, I would speak, take the first plane out at 6 a.m., I'm in my class at 9 a.m. I was keeping an absolutely frenzied schedule, frenetic schedule, but I was out there. And wherever I went, because I had a certain amount of notoriety, and also because it was the middle of the second Intifada, and also because there's a big Palestine solidarity network at American universities and Canadian universities and European universities and colleges, I had huge crowds. I was getting 300 people, 500 people, 1,000 people everywhere. I mean, literally everywhere. It was standing room only. And I knew I did my homework. I did not give rhetorical speeches, not at all. They were very methodical. It was the Chomsky style. I learned it at his lap, or at his knees, as the expression has it. And it was a Chomsky style. I prepared, I had all the facts, and I was convincing. And so I was becoming effective. And that was the problem. It was not my politics. It was that I was reaching a broad audience, and I was effective. I know it sounds arrogant. I'm human. I have 10,000 flaws, as Gandhi used to say, like everybody else. I have 10,000 flaws. But those considerations do not deter me. They do not, because I internalized deeply my parents' suffering and their feeling that, as my late mother used to say, the whole world abandoned them. The whole world abandoned them. And so there was no way that considerations of livelihood ever entered into my calculus about whether or not I will say something or not say something. That never happened. Of course, to some extent I was self-pitying, because, like you said, it was inevitable that was going to happen, the backlash. So why am I complaining? You knew what was going to happen, and then when it happened, you're sitting around pitying yourself. I don't have a job, I love to teach, I'll never be in a classroom again. Yeah, that part was inconsistent in me, because I wanted, so to speak, to have my cake and eat it. I want to be able to say the truth as I understood it, but then when I suffered the inevitable consequences, I was angry and very self-pitying about it. So there, I would say there was and continues to be an inconsistency in my character.
There's a moment. Now, I used to produce this Canadian television show, Counterspin. You were on it several times. I've seen other times video of you, speaking, and you keep your cool and you argue with facts. But there's one moment where you had an exchange with this young student, and it went viral. I think you were speaking to a bunch of students, and she argued with you, and in the course of arguing, she starts to cry, and you were pretty tough in the sense that you say to her, if I remember correctly, why aren't you shedding tears for the Palestinians? And there's a lot of hits on you for not being a little more, I don't know, compassionate or something. When you look back on that moment, because the thing really did go viral and it had some effect, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm a little tired of that video, because wherever I go in the Arab Muslim world, they play it over and over and over again.
Really?
So
why in the Arab world?
Because they like the idea. They interpreted it incorrectly. They thought the girl was Jewish, which she was not, and they interpreted it as me sort of, you know, it's all over the Arab world, it's the crocodile tear speech. They somehow feel vindicated by that speech. Don't ask me why. I was in Iran in March for 2 weeks, and I did a lot of TV programs. And every single TV program begins with this video. And they have a Persian translation, which is very dramatic, you know, like somebody's reading Shakespeare, to the point that I was getting nightmares at night hearing this video over and over and over again. How do I feel about it? I'll tell you how I feel about it. I don't recoil at what I said because it's how I feel, but that's not my speaking style.
Yeah, that's what I
So
thought.
it was so out of character. Anyone who thinks that's representative of me, they're in for a very big disappointment because I'm a very monotonous speaker. I adapted the Chomsky style. You know, don't appeal to any emotions. I have more humor than he does. He has a little irony. I have more humor, more undiluted humor than him. But I adopted the Chomsky style. So a lot of people...
So why did she get to you?
Why did she get...
Why did that moment?
Oh, well,
because that's what I'm saying. It isn't your style.
It rubbed me the wrong way that this young woman is going to be giving me lessons about how to talk about the Nazi Holocaust. I did not go through it for sure, but I was as close to it as anyone could be through the experience of my parents. And now for this woman to go up there and tell me, lecture me about how I should or shouldn't talk about the Nazi Holocaust, that just rubbed me the wrong way. Don't tell me. Don't tell me how to talk about it. I have given a lot of thought to it, and I had if I can use the word, a wrenching experience as a child growing up in that home. So I don't need lessons about how to talk about the Nazi Holocaust.
Okay. You teach at DePaul for 6 years.
2007 year, and then the 10-year year came.
So what happens?
The 10-year year, all hell broke loose. I'm under a out-of-court settlement where I'm not allowed to disparage DePaul. That's the terms of the settlement. But as I understand it, as it's been interpreted by the lawyers, including my wonderful, wonderful, wonderful lawyer, Lynn Bernabe, who handled the case, I'm allowed to speak anything that's factually correct. So as long as it's factually correct, I could say it. I would say, without sounding too conspiratorial, there were 3 members of the department who decided for different reasons they wanted to get rid of me. One of them had been in correspondence for 1 or 2 years with Professor Dershowitz at Harvard, and he was smitten by Dershowitz.
And for people watching this who don't know, Alan Dershowitz is a very famous American professor who's very close to the Israeli
emeritus
government.
now. He was the senior-most professor at Harvard Law School, but now he's emeritus. He left in June.
Very closely associated with various Israeli governments and consults for them and various things.
Courses, yes, Israeli courses. So the year before tenure, the chair, whose name I can name because that's factual, Pat Callahan, he began to prepare the ground to get rid of me. So in the annual evaluation, every professor in the department is subject to an annual evaluation. He ranked me the worst professor in the department, the worst teacher in the department, even though I had the highest student evaluations in the department. He then said my book, which had just come out from University of California Press, Beyond Chutzpah, which was 2/3 of it was devoted to Professor Dershowitz. He called the book worthless, which is okay except for one thing. He admits he never read the book. And when he was asked on what basis he determined that this University of California Press book, which had blurbs from the 6 leading scholars in the world, was worthless, he said he watched the debate between me and Dershowitz on Democracy Now! That was the level that they had sunk. And then the last year...
The debate's 2006?
Debate was 2006, yeah. And then the last year, Professor Dershowitz entered in a very big way. He sent a 60-page, literally, a 60-page dossier on me to every single member of the university and the administration, 60 pages. And then professors in the law school, everybody started to line up against me. Then Professor Dershowitz took out an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal telling DePaul not to hire me. Then
just for people who don't know university life, because some of our viewers don't, at a certain point a professor gets tenure. If they get a tenured position, it's very, very difficult then to get rid of that person. You have to do something pretty horrendous.
Correct, exactly correct. Then Sean Hannity, the right-wing commentator on Fox News, he did a segment where he quoted me at a rally during the 2006 Israeli attack on Lebanon. And again, people think I'm reckless. They're way off. Way off. I can be reckless in private, you know. I have my humor, but not in public. I'm very responsible. And it was the time when Israel was devastating Lebanon, and these Congress people were saying, we are all Israel now. And I was invited to a rally. I got up and I said, oh no, we're not all Israel now. We are now all Hezbollah. And I knew it's going to create a hysteria. I knew there would be people filming me. I thought about it. That's how I felt. We are all Hezbollah. And it was filmed. Sean Hannity showed it on the program. He picked up his pencil and he pointed and he says, DePaul, we are watching you. And then all sorts of dirtiness. No, just let me finish. Yeah. All sorts of dirtiness started to play itself out in the university. It was really ugly. It was very ugly, to the point that I didn't sleep at all at the end. I used to come to class. I would be up till around 4 a.m. I'd say, okay, it's pointless. Let me just go into school and answer emails. And I would come into class like a stray dog. I'm serious. I didn't bother washing. I didn't care about how I was dressed. And the students really rallied behind me. At the end, a number went on a hunger strike in support of me. I would say 2/3 was because they liked me. 1/3, they took pity on me. I was destroyed. It was horrible. What happened? I mean, that's just a fact.
You say you're not reckless.
No.
You think through carefully. Why say we're all Hezbollah and not say we're all Lebanese?
Because the Hezbollah was representing the resistance at that moment. It was the Hezbollah resistance that was fighting, and I respect that, I honor that. They were no different than during World War II when Americans were rallying behind Uncle Joe. You know, there were films, A Mission to Moscow, there were all these films in praise of Stalin. I don't compare the Hezbollah to the communists, but they're tough, they're ruthless, and they've done things, you know, lately with Syria, which I don't agree with at all. I can't accept it. I can understand it, I can't accept it. But at that point, I have no problem saying that because that's factually correct.
But there is also some, if you're reasoning this,
but you have a point.
Some tactical consideration.
No, I understand what you're saying, and you know what? It's a fair statement to make. Maybe I should have said we're all Lebanon now. There is an argument to be made there. But I'd like to give credit to those who do the fighting, the sacrifice, the dying. The communists and the socialists got it during World War II. Hezbollah is doing the fighting, did the fighting and the dying from 1983 until 2000 when they evicted the Israelis, and then in 2006. I honor that and I respect that. Even though, as I said, you know what Pete Seeger, I remember he said, he used to always defend the Soviet Union. Once he said at one point, but you know, I know that if I were in the Soviet Union, I'd probably be the first one thrown into the gulag. I understand those contradictions, but at that moment, we are all Hezbollah, just like in World War II, we are all the Red Army. With the Red Army go the heroes. And when I was growing up, had no influence on me by my parents, but I discovered Paul Robeson. And when Paul Robeson would sing, with the Red Army go the heroes, da, 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 it moved me deeply. It was the Red Army. They defeated the Nazis. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for their sacrifice. I want to honor that and respect that. The courage, which I don't have, or I don't think I have. Maybe I do if the circumstances were such that I had to find that courage in me, but I respect that. My lawyer, Lynn Berner-Bay, she said, look, Norm, if it went to court, you'll win. She said, I have no doubt about that. But tenure cases take a long time. It can take 4, 5, or 6 years. And you're the person who knows your case the most, so you're going to have to be writing up the briefs, the facts, and everything. It'll consume 6 years of your life. The other choice is just get an out-of-court settlement and move on in your life.
So in terms of moving on, you have not now, as of today, been able to get a job anywhere outside of, you're teaching once a week now, once a month for 1 week in Turkey. Right. Now you are one of the more foremost academics. You have, in terms of studying Israeli issues, Israeli-Palestine issues, in terms of your level of knowledge and so on, whether people agree or disagree with you, this is McCarthyite House American activities level of isolation, that you can't get a job in an institution here?
I would say the picture is not quite like that. Let me just explain it as I see it. First of all, it's not only I couldn't get a job in academia, I couldn't get any job, period. I couldn't get a job in a post office. I mean, you might think that's an exaggeration, but I can assure you it's not. The problem was, for some people, it was for ideological purposes. But for a lot of people, they're just administrators. You know nowadays, because you administer your program. A person walks in the room, they ask you, what's your name? You say, my name is Norman Finkelstein. The person is sitting down, and immediately they're going like this. As you're talking to them, how do you spell your name? And then they're Googling you. And then it comes up the Google. And then you get Norman Finkelstein, Holocaust denier, 40,000 websites. So the administrator, it's not the politics. Do you want somebody who has a reputation for being a Holocaust denier?
But there are people that run departments that know better.
They do know better, but that's my whole point. You're an administrator. The question is, when people start to complain, when they start having to endure the ordeal that DePaul endured. I endured an ordeal at DePaul, but it wasn't a pretty picture for them either. This is a third-tier university. It's like Main Street in Hooterville being hit by a tsunami. They didn't know what the hell is going on now. And so any administrator, they look after their institution. That's their job. So I'll give you an example, not the rarefied ivory tower. I applied to teach as a volunteer at a charter school in East Harlem. No. Why? Because she knows some kid, what does a kid do when he comes home first day of class? Googles the teacher's name. Holocaust denier. Mommy, come here, look at my teacher. Look, he's all over the web, 1 million websites. The parent's eyes like this. Oh my God, my son is being taught by a Holocaust denier. Starts complaining to the principal. Does any principal want to have to deal with that? You know,
of course what you're saying is true.
It's not just ideological animus, you know, it's also just being an administrator and how the system functions.
Yeah, I think you're being, I mean, it's realistic, but I also think you're being a little forgiving in the sense that there's some department heads at some universities, and it's kind of cowardice that they don't take a...
There's cowardice, but you know, you have to be inside academia to understand its operations, because from the outside and the inside have very little correlation with each other. I'll give you an example. I live in New York, okay? Columbia University, NYU, big institutions. Their faculties, most of their faculties are actually further left than me on these issues. Now I ask you a question. It's been 7 years. 7 years.
Since the poll.
Columbia has a Center for Palestine Studies, the first one in the United States, run by a very prominent professor, okay, a director of it. I don't know if he's officially director, but okay. NYU has the Kevorkian Center. And all of these big shot leftist, pro-Palestine, one-staters are on the faculty. Now I ask you a question. In the 7 years, it's an hour from my house, an hour, even less. Has any of them ever invited me to give, not to teach for a semester, to give a lecture. 7 years. Nothing. I have a friend, I love her. I'll be honest with you, at Harvard. Okay, I won't tell you her name. And she's in one of these programs. She sends me every week the list of speakers they have. Now finally, my innards begin to writhe. I said, has it ever occurred to you to invite me? Has it ever occurred to you? Because academics, it's you wash my hand, I wash, one hand washes the other. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. I have nothing to offer. I can't get you a good book review. I can't get you invited to a conference. I have nothing to offer you. I'm nothing. I can't even a blurb from me kills a book. I'm serious. So they didn't do anything for me. I don't care about the other side. Okay, that's their cause. That's what you expect. I'm talking about my side. Nothing.
Why?
Because I have nothing to offer them.
They invite people to speak that can't help them with this and that.
No, that's not really
Come on,
true.
I get invited to speak.
Okay, you know what, Paul? You have a point. A lot of people resented me even at the pool because they felt I was acting like a prima donna. I didn't want to play by the rules, but I still wanted to get tenure. Like you said, I knew what was going to happen, and I'm still speaking my mind, saying I support Hezbollah, saying with this, that, and the other. And, well, if he's going to carry on like that, we had to jump through the hoops. We had to sell our souls. I mean, how do you get a job like that? How do you get a job like that at Harvard or at NYU or at Columbia, and you call yourself a leftist? Believe me, you cut a lot of corners. You don't get a job otherwise. And there was this feeling towards me that he wants to have all the benefits of an academic without paying the price.
Which means staying within certain limits.
Yeah, staying within certain limits, carrying on in a certain way, and I didn't, And that's why I say there's an aspect of me which is, we can call it not hypocritical, but contradictory, that I want to be able to say and think as I do, but I then pity myself when the moment of truth comes and I have to pay the consequences. So there is a resentment towards me. And I'll tell you another thing, and I'm not afraid to say, I think I'm better than a lot of them. I know more. I work hard. They're going to wine and cheese conferences, wine and cheese parties, ridiculous conferences. They're always plotting conspiracies about this and that, because that's academic life. It's so petty, What did I do? My time wasn't squandered on that. I just sat home and worked. I worked very hard, and I'm not going to make I'm not going to pretend to otherwise. I worked very hard.
Do you think some of this isolation is personal?
Yeah, I've rubbed people the wrong way. I'm aware of that. The expression "take no prisoners." If you're a lousy scholar, I say it. I don't care if it's left, right, or center. And
a lot of the debates you've been having in the recent times have been with people on the left of you.
That's
in a
correct.
sense. I asked you off camera, just how do I introduce you, how I describe you, and do I say you're a critic of Zionism or anti-Zionism, anti-Zionist? And you say you actually don't talk about Zionism.
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, first of all, I have a material stake in Zionism because I wrote my doctoral thesis was From the Jewish Question to the Jewish State, an essay in the theory of Zionism. And since I got nothing else out of that experience, I didn't get a job out of it. And the only thing I have left from my whole wretched experience in graduate school was my thesis. And my thesis is on Zionism, but I'm categorically opposed to talking about Zionism. Because I don't think it means anything to this generation. I want to reach people. You have to find a language that can reach mainstream people. That's my goal. People understand the language of human rights. People understand the language of international law. If you say it's wrong for a state to discriminate against any of its citizens, people understand that. If you say it's wrong for a state to occupy another people's country, people understand that. When you say you're anti-Zionist, for most people, Zionism is some sort of body deodorant. Nobody knows what Zionism is.
So is it wrong to have a Jewish state?
It depends on what you mean by a Jewish state.
A Jewish a state whose
England has an Anglican church, but if you ask most Brits who are not Anglican, you ask a typical Muslim in England, or you ask a Jew in England, the fact that there's a state church doesn't really impinge on them as individuals in that state. Most will say no, they couldn't care less. But once you start having pronounced features of a Jewish state, then it becomes a real problem.
But there's also a difference. In
pronounced
England,
legal.
No, but hang on for a second. In England, the Christian character of the state, it's not an ethnicity. It goes back to religious, cultural traditions. It doesn't mean anyone who's a Christian can come immigrate to England. There's not really any status or privileges to go with that.
As I said,
but hang on. But in the Israeli state, if they're going to keep the demographics,
I totally agree with that. Once status and privilege starts entering in the picture, you have a problem. But we have to be careful about the nature of the problem. I live in the United States. Okay, technically we're a secular society, but our day of Sabbath is Sunday. It's Sunday and it's not Saturday, which is the Jewish day of Sabbath, and it's not Friday, which is the Muslim day of Sabbath. It's Sunday because it was a Christian country. Everybody acknowledges, unless you're going to be really blind, we have a national holiday. It's Christmas. It's not Hanukkah.
Yeah, okay,
it's not Eid.
But hang on,
it's Christmas.
let me make this
So
point.
every state has a religious or ethnic shadow. Every state has one. The question is how dark that shadow is. And when it starts to create serious issues of privilege and exclusivity, then it becomes a problem.
So in
Israel, it's a big problem.
Yeah, because there's a very specific thing. They're trying to say that people that have a Jewish ethnicity can live here, can emigrate here. Anyone who's Jewish has an automatic right of return. But Palestinians,
I recognize that.
But the point is that demographic, that kind of Jewish state.
Right.
That's what I think people think when they talk about Zionism.
Okay, look, there are two different issues here. One is the question of Israel as a Jewish state. The second is the issue of Zionism. So on the second issue, which is the one you asked me, I think you can talk about all of these issues: privilege in the state, status in the state, discrimination in the state, exclusivity in the state. You can use the normal language of human rights, equality under the law, international law. You can discuss all of these issues without talking about Zionism. And so I don't want to drag into Zionism only because I think you lose people. Then it becomes this polarized debate with are you or are you not a Zionist? Whereas I think you can have a much bigger possibility of reaching people if you ask, are you or are you against a state that discriminates against some of its citizens? Are you or are you not against an exclusivist state? Are you or are you not against a state which grants privileges to one group of people and denies those privileges to other groups of people? Then you can reach people, you can talk to them. I have a lot of experience talking to people. I was out there, as I said, 500 people, big audiences. I know what reaches people and what evokes a yawn. And once it starts to be a debate between a student in the audience and you over Zionism, about 98% of the audience checks out because it becomes a kind of in-house debate. Are you or are you not a Zionist?
Okay, but I'm not even asking
Right.
are you or are you not a Zionist. I'm saying are you or are you not in agreement that there should be a Jewish state with the right to defend the demographics of Israel so they maintain a majority Jewish population?
I would say that that's a complicated question because every state has the right to regulate its immigration and emigration. That's a right that redounds on any state in our state system. Now, let's take a question of, I'll give you an example. Let's take the question of Tibet, okay? The Chinese, Han Chinese, they want to bring in large numbers of Han Chinese in order to dilute the Tibetan population, eventually outnumber them, and then it will no longer be Tibet, or it won't be a Tibetan Tibet. It will just be another Han Chinese province. So
you think this is a comparable situation?
Well, I'm saying, do the Tibetans have the right to say, we reject this massive immigration because it's going to change the ethnic character of our Tibet? The answer, in my opinion, is yes. Yes, the Indonesians tried to do the same thing.
But does that apply to Israel?
I would say clearly it applies to the occupied territories. That if you look at Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which says you can't transfer populations from the occupier country to the occupied territory. One of the reasons, if you read the commentary on the Fourth Geneva Convention, it's called the Pictet Commentary, one of the reasons they say is because an occupied territory has the right to maintain its racial demographic.
So Palestinians have a right to say no settlements.
Correct.
But I'm asking you, you know what I'm asking?
I understand what you're asking me, and I think it's a tough question. On what rights does a state have to regulate the ethnic balance of a state? In my opinion, it's a tough question.
Because then you could argue the United States could, want more white people and start having...
Right, the United States did that for a very long time.
And to a large extent, a lot of these countries still do.
It discriminated against South Europeans, Italians, and of course it discriminated against Jews in its various immigration laws in the early part of the century, the 1924 immigration law. Yeah, the United States did that. Now our policy is it discriminates on the basis of job qualifications. If you have a certain, you have a professional capacity which is useful, then you get some sort of priority in our immigration, and you're not allowed to discriminate again on the basis of religion.
But why is it a complicated question? You've got a state that's essentially given birth to as an occupier state. You have ethnic cleansing of the local population.
Right.
Then you have, okay, Jews from anywhere can come, but all Palestinians and descendants of those who actually lived here can't come back. Why is it complicated? There's something wrong with that if you're going to call yourself a modern democratic state.
Well, because as I said, it's not inconsistent between the principle of being a modern democratic state on the one hand and a state having the right to regulate its immigration policies. That's a right that states have.
Well, I'm not arguing that, but we're arguing whether it can be any modern democratic state should base it on race, right?
Listen, I don't want to get into an argument about this because the bottom line, we agree. And there's no point now in me trying to split hairs. Under international law, the Palestinians have a right of return. Human Rights Watch in the year 2000, Amnesty International in 2001, each of the major human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they both issued position papers, and both of them said that under international law, The Palestinians who were expelled in 1948 and then in 1967, they, and the expression they use, they and successive generations which have maintained genuine links with the land, that's the expression they use, successive generations that have maintained genuine links with the land, they have the right to return. I'm not going to quarrel with Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. I told you earlier I tried to stick pretty closely to what international law says. I think they're fair interpreters of the international law, so I'm not going to quarrel with it. On the other hand, I recognize as a practical political matter, this is a tough issue to solve. And then we have to figure out ways to resolve it.
Okay. In the next segment, we're going to talk about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, something that Norman has a lot of criticism of. So please join us on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News for the continuation of our series with Norman Finkelstein. Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself. I'm Paul J. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has claimed quite a few successes in the last year or two. For example, in December 2013, the Netherlands' largest supplier of drinking water said it was severing ties with Israeli national water company Meroat, I'm sure I'm butchering that, because of the political context of Israel's West Bank settlements. Again, December 2013, the American Studies Association members voted in favor of endorsing the academic boycott of Israel by a 2-to-1 margin, making it the second major U.S. scholarly association after the Association for Asian American Studies to do so. January 2014, the Netherlands' largest pension fund management company has decided to withdraw all its investments from Israel's 5 largest banks because they have branches in the West Bank or are involved in financing construction in the settlements. February 2014, 2 leading international companies bidding to build private seaports dropped out of the government's tender due to concerns over the political repercussions. June 2014, Presbyterian Church of the USA voted to divest from 3 companies it cited for profiting from the occupation. August 2014, the Ontario branch of the Canadian Federation of Students, representing more than 300,000 university students in the province, unanimously passed a motion to boycott Israel. December 10th, 2014, University of California Graduate Student Worker Union voted in favor of a resolution supporting an academic boycott of Israel. The union represents 13,000 student workers in the University of California system. All of this leads up to the next segment of our interview with Norman Finkelstein. Norman is known to be a critic, and we're going to kind of discuss all of this, of the BDS movement. And he now joins us in the studio.
No, thank you so much for having me.
So once again, Norman's an academic, one of the best known critics of Israeli policy. His most recent book is Method and Madness, The Hidden Story of Israel's Assault on Gaza. So, well, just what is your position on the BDS movement? What do you make of it?
Well, first of all, we have to be clear what we mean by the BDS movement. If you mean boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, of course I support them. I was actively involved, for example, in petitioning the Presbyterians in 2005, in 2006 in Birmingham, to get them to divest from their holdings, which implicated the West Bank, and I don't know if Gaza at the time, I think the West Bank. So I've always been an active proponent of the boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. But that's not BDS with a capital B, capital D, uppercase B, uppercase D, and uppercase S. BDS says that those are just boycotting acts. That's the expression they use. But they say BDS is a platform. And the platform, they say, is anchored in international law. They say that the international law guarantees the rights of Palestinians to self-determination, which is true. That was upheld by the International Court of Justice in 2004. And then they derive from this right of self-determination 3 other rights. And the 3 other rights are Israel has to end its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. There has to be implementation of the right of return. and there has to be equality of citizenship for Palestinian Arabs in Israel. And all of that is correct. But there's one thing that's left out. Under international law, Israel is also a state. And BDS is, as it likes to say, quote, "we take no position on Israel." Now that doesn't make any sense to me. I told you before, number one, I'm a stickler about international law. You have to be consistent. I can't publicly argue a position any longer. I did as a young man, for those who want to see the old segments of this interview. But as an adult, I no longer can argue positions which are, in my view, intellectually either inconsistent or disingenuous, which is just a euphemism for dishonest. Israel is a state under international law. You can't claim rights for yourself, but then when it comes to the rights to the other party to the conflict, to claim to have no position. That doesn't make any sense to me. If you claim, as BDS does, the first sentence of their call from 2005, the first sentence of their call says, "we're anchored in international law." Then they purposely timed the call for, it was July 2005. It was 1 year after the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legality of the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories. And they said, we're organizing BDS because everyone's ignoring the ICJ opinion. And we are trying to enforce the law. Fine, but the ICJ opinion, the very last sentence in the ICJ opinion says, we look forward to two states, an Israeli state side by side with a Palestinian state. So you can't be agnostic on the question, why?
Why can't you be?
You can't be because you can do one of two things. You can say, which is a perfectly reasonable position, you could say to hell with the law. I don't care what international law says. International law is made by privileged states, it's made by imperialists, it's made by so on and so forth. You know the rhetoric, so I don't have to go through it with you. You can take that position and say, we don't care about international law. We don't care if international law recognizes Israel. We don't. That's fine. Or we don't take a position. Or the second option is you say you are anchored in international law, but then you have to take the good and bad of the law. You take it as a package. You can't say, for example, I have the right to walk at the green, but I have no opinion on the red.
Okay, I'm not...
Law consists of two things, rights and obligations, rights and responsibilities. You can't just claim rights for yourself, but then claim to be agnostic or, quote, I don't have an opinion on your obligations to others. That's not the law. That's cherry picking the law. That's what Israel always did. Israel kept saying to the Palestinians, you have to recognize us. You have to recognize us. But they refused to recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination and statehood. If it was wrong for Israel to do that because it demanded a right for itself, but not its obligation to the Palestinians, it's wrong for the other side to do it.
There's many examples of broad fronts, united fronts being organized, where there's all kinds of disagreement about what comes next. And you can go back to the Kuomintang and Chairman Mao's army, the Chinese Liberation Army. You can go to united fronts in Europe against fascism. It's actually the whole nature of a broad united front, that people disagree about all kinds of stuff, but you can find enough common ground to have an effective policy, well, then you do that. So what's wrong with BDS? Now, I have no idea how the BDS people will or will not respond to you. I'm just giving you my own view.
They'll never respond because they know what I'm saying is true.
Wait a sec.
Listen, they've been asked to debate me. I can tell you for a fact. Omar Barghouti, he's been asked to debate me on Democracy Now!, and his answer is, Finkelstein's not important. Let me talk to important people. They won't debate me on the issue because what I'm saying is so transparently true, unless you want to make the preposterous argument, as some tried to do when I was at Oxford a few months ago with Mehdi Hassan on Head to Head. And there were people who were trying to tell me Israel's not a state.
But if I understand...
That's just so ridiculous. How can you argue with people like that? That's a cult. You understand what a cult is? A cult is when you simply, by fiat, by fatwa, you deny a reality. And among your group, you simply, whatever the guru says, you nod your head. I was in it. Yeah. Chairman Mao says, so now there's another guru. And you just pretend that the rest of the world is not out there.
But they're not saying they don't recognize Israel.
Of course they are saying that.
No, they're not. They're saying they won't say.
Of course they're saying that. Of course they're saying that. Have you read, for example, the commentator from Chicago, I won't name him, very active in BDS, who attacks Sweden for recognizing the Palestinians because it's two states. Attacks the French, attacks the Irish, attacks the House of Commons, attacks them all. Why? Because they're calling for two states. Of course that's the reason. Now, you have the right to that opinion. I'm not contesting it. I'm not disputing it. I'm not denying it. But what you can't do from the point of view of elementary intellectual consistency is to deny the state of Israel and then claim all you're asking for is what you're entitled to under international law. That's not consistent.
Yeah, but you're
Number two, you made an important point. You said that people form coalitions from the point of view of finding common ground in order to reach a broad public. And that's correct. I agree with that. But I have a lot of experience. I'm not trying to lord it over you, but I have 32 years experience how you try to reach a broad public, how you break out of your cocoon and you reach a broad public.
But look,
I'm going to get to that.
These are successful.
I'm going to get to that in a moment.
By the way, just for people who don't know, I'm pointing at the piece of paper I was reading.
I'm going to get to that in a half moment. Now, there's no way, if you are trying to reach a broad public and you say you have no position on Israel, you lose them.
No position on the issue of whether it's one state or two state, or the legitimacy of the state.
You have no position on Israel. The standard response is, the stock response is, we take no position on Israel. Now, you try to reach a broad public by saying we take no position on Israel.
No, come on, that's not what they're saying.
Of course that's what
they're saying. No, they're saying boycott Israel. How can you not have a position?
They say we take, when you ask them, where do you stand on Israel? Which comes up in any public debate. Any public debate, once you break out of the cocoon and you try to reach out, everybody asks, where do you stand in Israel? And then to say I have no position, you lose people. Now you listed to me all of these victories, which are correct, they're impressive, they are testament to the commitment, the conviction, the organization of the BDS movement. I will not for a moment dispute that. But what you miss is all of the victories you cited, they only target the settlements. They only target what's in occupied Palestinian territory under international law. So, if you read, for example, the Presbyterian statement, which I read carefully, they always start out by saying, of course we support Israel. Of course we recognize Israel. Of course Israel has a right to exist. So from the point of view of BDS, those are not BDS victories. They are victories for exactly what I support. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel where it's breaking international law. But it's not questioning Israel's right to exist.
That's not what they call for.
Of course they do. I mean...
They don't call for that. No,
ask any person from BDS, well, forget about ask. Where is it in the platform? You say you're anchored in international law.
And I'm
So where
saying,
is Israel on the platform?
I'm saying the argument I would give if I were them,
They don't give an argument.
is simply that we're not going to split this movement because there's people on both sides of this question.
But you see, Paul.
Which is why it's called the United Front.
Paul, you missed one point, which maybe I didn't convey with a sufficient amount of clarity, so the problem can be mine. You're worried about whether or not you're going to split the movement. I'm worried about whether or not you're going to reach a public. Can you reach a broad public? Do you read opinion polls in the United States? Can you show me an opinion poll which shows not even a majority? How about a small minority?
Oh, come on. You can't tell me that the victories they've had with these organizations didn't reach a broad public.
Actually,
tell me someone who's having more effect. Who's having more effect?
Yeah. You see, Paul, the problem is when BDS organizes concrete campaigns, they never take an agnostic position on Israel. Look at the question of Berkeley. Berkeley was a very interesting case. Berkeley, when they passed the resolution, if you read the resolution, it explicitly distances itself from BDS, the actual resolution. It explicitly recognizes Israel, actually in ways which go beyond what I think is required under international law. Those are not BDS victories. Those are victories against BDS. They explicitly recognize Israel. So you're worried about splitting the movement, and I say if you remain agnostic on the question of Israel, you may be able to hold together the movement without me, but okay. You may be able to hold together the movement, but you're never going to reach a broad public. They reach a broad public, which is correct, I agree with you, when they only target the settlements. That's when they reach a broad public. The moment you start raising the idea of one state, you lose the public. Whether you like it or not, and no doubt you don't, whether you like it or not, the idea of Israel as a state is deeply entrenched in the consciousness.
Don't suggest what I like or don't like. I'm asking you questions. I haven't told you what I like.
It's deeply entrenched in the consciousness of the West. Now, you may not like it, but that's a fact. When you start throwing the question of Israel's existence into doubt, as in we have no opinion, you lose the broad public.
Okay, Norman's promised to come back again, and we're going to pick all this up, and maybe we will get somebody from BDS who can do this debate, because right now I'm just asking questions. Thanks very much for joining us. So we're going to kind of end this series for now, but we're sooner than later going to pick up again. Thanks for joining us on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network.